Let me tell you about one of the strangest and funniest moments I've ever had in front of a college classroom. For the last couple of years here at ISU, I've taught a course called Genocide in Comparative and Historical Perspective. And the students have been lovely. It's been a great experience. But one day I was sort of in the middle of a lesson, and the student basically said, "Stop, Dr. Land. You've got it all wrong. Because we know why the Holocaust happened." So she had the undivided attention of the room, and she proceeded to describe something called the Milgram experiment in detail. She had a number of examples. She had the Milgram experiment and the Zimbardo prison, the Stanford prison experiment. So basically what these involved were experimental settings where students were assigned to different roles. Some were allowed to give orders, some had to obey. You get role play. Some people get to be the prison guards, others are the prisoners. Some people are the experimenters and order folks to administer an increasingly powerful series of electric shocks. And her takeaway from this is that human beings are naturally obedient. And so you give somebody a guy in a white coat, or you give somebody the role of the military officer, the prison warden, and folks fall into line. So basically, I mean, she was very good-natured about it. She seemed to feel I clearly had not heard of these experiments, because otherwise I'd be teaching the course very differently. But science had spoken. We, in fact, knew how human nature worked. So I find this fascinating from a lot of perspectives. A 20, 22-year-old student will have heard a lot in their life, a lot of different anecdotes and examples. It's interesting to me that these particular experiments make such a naturally deep impression, that someone can recite the details from memory even years later. Or to put it another way, isn't it interesting that students will accept the worst story they've ever heard about human nature? But just from a teaching perspective, I have to say, after years in the classroom, I'm a little bit skeptical about that kind of take on human nature, frankly, because I'm often in the position of giving instructions, or if you like, giving orders. If you give the same instruction to 20 people or 50 people, what you actually get is a patchwork of reactions. They understand the instruction differently. Frankly, some of them don't respond very well because they don't like getting instructions at all. So just from my own everyday experience of human nature, I'm a little bit skeptical. But also as a historian, when we study human history's worst moments, is this actually what we see? And one of the examples I share with students, I am familiar with the Milgram experiment, but I'm also familiar with books like this. This is Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, which was a study of German soldiers in World War II in Poland in the height of the Holocaust, who were given the order to serve as firing squads. Here are some civilians. Some of them are old, some of them are young, some of them are women, some of them are children. They're all begging for their lives, and you are supposed to shoot them point blank. And what, in fact, we get is one order, at least 12 different reactions. Some soldiers shot them in the face and enjoyed it, even if they were splattered with blood. Some soldiers deliberately shot off to the side. Some soldiers complied and then became so mentally disturbed they had to be relieved of duty later. Some soldiers basically walked off into the woods, said not a word, but didn't comply with the orders. Others basically let their supposed victims walk off into the woods where they had to be chased after by other squads of soldiers later. So if we look at real human beings in real situations, I think what we typically find is a much more complicated picture. So in the classroom, what I try to do, without, of course, denying that genocide happens, and it is, in fact, a course about genocide, is to give students a somewhat more diverse menu to think about. It's like a menu of different options. What is human nature? How do people react in different situations? One story I like to tell them when they bring up the Milgram experiment is something that happened to me. I was at Walmart in the winter, in our lovely Terre Haute winters, and my car got stuck in the ice and snow. And I couldn't figure out, I was wiggling one way, I was wiggling another, I couldn't get loose. And lo and behold, all of these drivers stopped their cars and spontaneously came forward to help me. And I have to admit, I was a little bit happy, I was a little bit pleased to see that. I guess I'm jaded like everybody else. I sometimes assume the worst about humanity. But it was really kind of nice to have these total strangers come and help me out of the snow. Now, as my students sometimes point out to me, maybe they did that because you were blocking the road. Maybe it was smart for them to help you out. That doesn't mean they were necessarily saints or angels. But actually, there are a lot of human situations in which the smart thing to do is also, you might say, the decent thing to do. So we can think of a whole category of sort of everyday altruism. So if we think that there's a larger social science literature, that's one way I would approach this question of how do we situate the Milgram experiment or the Stanford Prison experiment in a larger picture. There are actually social scientists working on all these different aspects and situations. So here's a book to consider with the uplifting title, Why Not Kill Them All? ? The Logic and Prevention of Mass Political Violence. So if we dig into the table of contents a little bit and look at the section headings, right, we get considerations like kind of basic statements we can make about the historical record. Most societies don't produce genocides. There are no genocides. We can look at many societies where ethnic and religious groups have lived side by side as neighbors for centuries without murderous exterminationist violence. And again, just drilling down a little bit into the section headings. They have a section heading called the mercantile imperative, which is a sort of fancy way of saying it might be more practical to trade with your neighbors rather than turn them into enemies or drive them away. So again, without denying that there are moments in human history where we turn murderous against each other, we need to situate that in a larger context. So what we might say, in addition to everyday altruism, is we need a sort of heading called everyday coexistence. Have a look at this photograph. Don't get too distracted by the guy's expression. This was taken about 100 years ago in Salonika, which is today in Greece, back then part of the Ottoman Empire. I think he looks a little bit grumpy because they were making him stare into the sun to have his picture taken. But this fellow is a street vendor. He's helping people with their aching feet. So you can see he's got a little model of a foot, and he's going to help you. Please take your shoes off, step right up. He'll see what he can do. But have a look at the sign next to him. So it's got the name of his business, and the first line is in Turkish. The line under that is in Greek. I believe there's a line in French. Dig a little deeper, and there's Hebrew lettering. That's in Ladino, so it's a Spanish dialect, but it's spelled with Hebrew letters. Now, I assure you, this fellow is not a circus act or a world award-winning linguist. This was life in Salonika. These folks lived down the street from each other, and he's not advertising his business in 6 languages because he's some sort of humanitarian. He's doing it because it was good for business. This was what his town was like. And Salonika had Muslims, Jews, and Christians down the street from each other for centuries. This is something that I study. We call them cosmopolitan port towns. And they were throughout the coast of what's now the Middle East, parts of the Indian Ocean, looking forward and out to the South China Sea. So what does this actually look like? What does everyday coexistence look like? This is where it gets a little bit more tangled. Social scientists have come up with different names for this, including friendly enmity and antagonistic tolerance, but I illustrate it here for you with an image of a seesaw, or depending on where you grew up, you might call it a teeter-totter, but it's something we can all relate to. I think most of us have been on seesaws as children. There's constant motion, but there's also a certain degree of stability. So you can have these friendly rivalries within communities. For instance, in Salonika, the town where that photograph came from, It became Muslim-dominated after a certain point, but they didn't do away with St. George. Christians lit candles to St. George. The Muslims actually appropriated him. He had a long career as Musa Baba, a Muslim saint. So whose saint is he in the end? It becomes a little bit complicated to answer that question. There are temples in port towns in the Indian Ocean. They're clearly temples. They're clearly places of worship. Which faith do they belong to? A little bit hard to answer that question because they have objects, gods, goddesses, and icons from 5 different faiths in the same temple. So we're looking at communities where human beings, perhaps for very good, practical, everyday reasons, found it relatable and workable and realistic to share their communities. And these are, if you like, stable, remarkably stable situations. As a historian, I find it really interesting to examine those communities at the moment when things went bad. And they did go bad in a number of them. Jonathan Glassman has written a very interesting book about Zanzibar, a port on the Indian Ocean, where there were some terrible riots in 1964 that ended a tradition of tolerance that had gone back centuries. So this is what I call the problem of the backsliding mob. Yes, people went along with the violence, but actually, as Glassman puts it, and it's kind of a cynical expression he uses, but he says, genocide is really an exercise in community building. And what he means when he says that is the people who carried out that violence did so against their instincts, their customs, their past experience. They then had to struggle to reconcile what they were doing today with the way that their ancestors had lived. And the way he describes it is almost a process of coaxing or coaching or training. Because it's not the case that human beings, when they receive an order, go into a trance-like state and follow orders like zombies. They continue to think, they continue to process it. So part of what Glassman really delves into in this book is how do you take people with one set of memories and values and customs and gradually translate that into a new set that's less tolerant. The outcome is by no means certain, and in fact, just as with Christopher Browning's firing squads, you get people who get cold feet or change their mind in the middle of the violence. So let me wrap up sort of where I started with education. Again, it fascinates me that my students can remember so vividly the Milgram experiment or the Stanford Prison experiment. Actually, what that shows is that, in a sense, somebody taught them really well, taught them in a memorable way, taught them in a vivid way. And I'm certainly not suggesting we should cease to teach students about that. But clearly we need some balance. If you want, as I'm sure you do, a world in which genocide is becoming increasingly less common rather than increasingly more common, then what we also need to be teaching the next generation is a more complicated view of human nature that includes this whole spectrum of different reactions. So I've taught the course in partnership with our local Holocaust Museum, Candles. My favorite thing, my personal favorite thing about Candles is that even though it was founded by Eva Kor, a Holocaust survivor, and in certain ways simply tells her story, her life story, and her experience in Auschwitz, what Candles has in fact become is an institution that invites people who are involved or concerned or have survived recent genocides, current genocides, here to Terre Haute. So lots of Terre Haute high schoolers have met survivors of the Darfur genocide, for instance, or witnesses to what happened in Rwanda because of Candles. I would like to underscore at the end, simply because I think it needs to be said, it's worth reminding ourselves that empathy and concern are also part of human nature. I've been to Auschwitz twice now with Candles groups. The first time was January 2015, and this is a photograph I took of part of our group. I'd like to draw your attention to the gentleman in the red coat. His name is Emmanuel, and he is from Rwanda. So he had flown from Africa to Poland, to Europe, in January, mind you, to stand there in the snow with us. You see him standing there by a railroad car on the infamous railroad tracks in the middle of Auschwitz. Emmanuel saw his parents die in the Rwandan genocide in 1994. He was just a child. And frankly, I don't think any of us would think less of him if he spent the rest of his life just trying to take care of himself, or talking about what he personally had experienced and what his country had gone through. But Emmanuel met Eva Kor and learned about the Holocaust and wanted to go to Poland in the winter for the 50th anniversary of the camp's liberation and to see what she had seen and experience that at some level. So when we are formulating our theories of human nature, whether it's about obedience and conformity and operant conditioning, to everyday altruism or everyday coexistence, I hope we'll also make room for people like Emmanuel, because I don't want to subscribe to any theory of human nature that doesn't include him. Thank you.